This investigation is sponsored by Wonder. Hey fellow seekers, I'm Mr. Mythos. In the 4th century BC, the Greek philosopher Plato recorded the story of Atlantis, an ancient, advanced, and truly massive civilization that faced an apocalypse which wiped every trace of their existence from the earth. Since the very beginning, the lineage of Plato's students couldn't agree whether Atlantis was a fictional tale, as believed by Aristotle, or a true historical record, as argued for by Crantor. Crantor felt so strongly that Atlantis was real that he traveled to Egypt himself to confirm it, and upon his return he stated with confidence, quote, "This is testified by the prophets of the Egyptians who assert that these particulars, the story of Atlantis, are written on pillars which are still preserved." End quote. Today, we'll get to those pillars. We'll also speculate on other controversial potential records of world-wiping destruction, from the mountain caves of Russia and the buried ruins of Turkey, to the worldwide myths that repeat the same stories of floods, giants, and celestial gods. And, of course, the dark side of archaeological dogma. But before we dive in, I cover a lot of topics that are so obscure, esoteric, or even lost to history that I'm a huge fan of using AI-generated art in my videos. And in this video, I've been using today's sponsor, Wonder, an app that turns your words into digital art so impressive you can hardly tell it wasn't made by a human. And trust me, it's super easy and super addictive. And here's how I do it. Just pick an adjective like ancient, then a subject, alien, then describe the situation, like eating a sandwich during the apocalypse. Finally, choose a style. I'll do cinematic. Then hit create. This is just a simple example. You can get as detailed as you want in your prompt, and in just a few seconds, your words are brought to life. Wonder Premium, which you're going to get a free trial of, gives you unlimited faster generations with 0 ads and access to over 20 styles. I use Wonder for work, inspiration, and just plain fun. So let's do it again. Creepy cat performing evil magic, and of course we'll pick the magic style. Look at that, I love it, and it's so fast. If you want to see the power of bringing your ideas to life, fast, unlimited, and in any style you want, use my link to download Wonder and get a free premium trial to put your creativity to the test. Thanks again to Wonder. It's time for the ancient apocalypse. According to Plato, the story of Atlantis had been passed down orally since it was first revealed to his 6th-generation ancestor, Solon. Solon was a respected Greek statesman and a pioneer of democracy in Athens, but beyond politics, he was a part-time seeker of lost and forgotten truths. Between 590 and 580 BC, Solon visited a city known as Sais in northern Egypt to consult with the world's most famous keepers of ancient history, the priests at Sais' central temple. They welcomed him in as an honored guest. Solon then asked if the Egyptians possessed records of past events unknown to the Greeks. One of the priests, the oldest among them, smiled wryly and approached him. Quote, "Oh, Solon, you Hellenistic Greeks are never anything but children, and there is not an old man among you." End quote. Solon was more confused than offended and asked what the elder meant. The priest replied, quote, "In mind you are all young. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age. And I will tell you why. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water. You remember a single deluge only, but there were many previous ones. You do not know that there formerly dwelt in your land the fairest and noblest race of men which ever lived, and that you and your whole city are descended from a small seed or remnant of them which survived. And this was unknown to you because for many generations, the survivors of that destruction died, leaving no written word." End quote. The aged Egyptian went on to reveal the name of this civilization, Atlantis. In the distant past, the Atlanteans were a vast and powerful empire who not only ruled their own continent, but conquered many other civilizations across Europe and Africa. Quote, "But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis, in like manner, disappeared into the depths of the sea." End quote. The priests went on to reveal inscriptions on the temple's pillars. They were records specifying that the sinking of Atlantis occurred over 9,000 years prior to Solon's visit. According to Plato, Solon made his journey to Egypt in 585 BC, so that would date Atlantis to over 11,550 years ago from today. That's extremely close to the scientific dating of a true-to-life ancient apocalypse, the Younger Dryas. In modern science, the Younger Dryas refers to a very real and sudden catastrophic event, a planet-wide apocalypse that occurred between 12,900 and 11,700 years ago. The Younger Dryas was the end of times for much life on Earth, and for reasons we still don't really understand. Almost immediately after its onset, there was a mass extinction of Ice Age megafauna across the planet. In North America, for example, 82% of mammals weighing over 90 pounds died abruptly. 74% in South America, 71% in Australia, and so on. At least one confirmed human culture disappeared, that being the Clovis people, one of the earliest known cultures of the Americas, and what happened to them remains a mystery. Despite many still debated details, the Younger Dryas brought with it 4 key terrors that all scientists can agree desolated our planet irreversibly when it struck. First, the deluge. A great flood swept across much of the world. Humans and animals alike were forced to flee to high ground immediately as the sea levels rose in front of their eyes. The mainstream belief is that the source of this water was from Lake Agassiz, a North American glacial lake that melted and spilled into the ocean. The problem is that there's still not much evidence for this theory, and modern-day simulations are failing to support it. However, there's another hypothesis for what may have caused the flood, and we'll get to that soon. Second, the abrupt global cooling. Earth's atmospheric temperature declined sharply within a matter of decades, a mere blink in our planet's timeline. Many regions declined anywhere from 5 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and some even more. Glaciers and ice fields formed, and the air became incredibly dry. Third, firestorms across the planet. Suddenly and inexplicably, the grass, flowers, bushes, trees, weeds, and most vegetation across 4 continents were set ablaze. It's estimated that 10% of Earth's biomass was lost by the end. Fourth, what experts refer to as the black mat. Across the world, a layer of black organic sediment can be found at a certain depth. Disturbingly, no Ice Age megafauna fossils have ever been found above the black mat, only under it, and usually covered by it. This suggests that the black mat, or where it came from, was the direct cause of their sudden mass extinction. Microscopic analysis revealed that many of these particles are nanodiamonds, as well as magnetic metals with unique molecular structures, all materials whose formation strongly point toward an extraterrestrial origin. And this brings us to the Clovis Comet hypothesis. As I mentioned, the old belief that the melting of the glacial lake Agassiz is losing credibility, and in its place is something that was once considered incredibly controversial, the theory that the Younger Dryas may have been caused by an object hurled at Earth from the heavens. In 1882, the American Congressman Ignatius Donnelly paused his rather successful political career to become a full-time Atlantis investigator. He released multiple books that became extremely popular and influential. Donnelly's first book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, argued that Atlantis had been destroyed in the same event recorded in the Bible, the Great Flood. But his second book, Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel, focused on his theories and evidence for the cause of that ancient apocalypse. Donnelly argued that the world cataclysm was triggered by a comet impact. Ignatius Donnelly's evidence wasn't really scientific, and his books seriously haven't aged well. But all aside, the man may have guessed right. The event of great destruction that erased much of mankind some 12,000 years ago may have resulted from a comet impact. In 2007, 125 years after Donnelly, the first true scholarly paper to introduce the comet impact hypothesis argued that, quote, one or more low-density extraterrestrial objects exploded over northern North America, partially destabilizing the Laurentide ice sheet and triggering the younger Dryas cooling, end quote. This idea that a comet was the cataclysm's catalyst continues to rack up overwhelming evidence. In the last decade, well over 100 research papers have been published on it because it answers so many prevailing questions. The phenomenon known as an impact winter occurs when a comet hits Earth with enough force that it essentially disintegrates into particles and blasts outward into the atmosphere. The particle cloud would be thick enough to block sunlight and solar radiation, causing an abrupt drop in temperature across the world, explaining the sudden global cooling. Most likely this comet would have broken into smaller pieces, high in the atmosphere. Thus, multiple impacts would have spread across the globe, each instantly setting ablaze all nearby vegetation, explaining the firestorms. Eventually, the dark particle cloud caused by the impacts would settle on the surface of the Earth, explaining the black mat. The final piece of the puzzle, of course, is the Great Flood, and the simple explanation is that a fragment of the comet landed on a large ice sheet and melted it. The geological and astrological evidence for the Clovis comet hypothesis continues to build every year. It's named after the Clovis people, by the way, the one confirmed society whose end resulted from the younger Dryas. The black mat and the mass megafauna extinction were by and large the most extreme in North America, where the Clovis people lived at that time, and where they vanished and were never seen again. Most scientists who support the comet hypothesis argue that North America was faced with the largest comet fragment, exploding over the continent with the force of millions of hydrogen bombs. According to the NASA geologist and extraterrestrial impact specialist Dr. Ted Bunch, if the Clovis people were populated near the impact site, quote, the detonation may have fried them, or the shockwave would have compressed them. Others would have been wiped out in massive fires and floods, end quote. But for all humans across the world who avoided instant death, there would have been countless witnesses. Flaming comet fragments that brought with them an ancient apocalypse. It's something worth recording, somehow, and in a form of record that would hopefully survive such an event in the future. That's what we'll be investigating next. In Plato's story of Atlantis, and from Crantor's later confirmation, the records are supposed to have been preserved in the Egyptian city of Sais. Sais was a real place, whose origins date back to the final years of the Stone Age. From 3000 BC until the Persians invaded and conquered it in the mid-6th century BC, Sais was a renowned center of culture and knowledge, lived in and visited by many great thinkers like Solon. The city's main temple, whose pillars supposedly preserve these records, was known to be one of the most important temples in all of Egypt. And it was so ancient that the Greek historian Herodotus noted that this temple was the burial place of the Egyptian god Osiris, a figure often associated with Atlantis by occultists. The problem with finding the Atlantis records is that in the last 2,000 years, Sais fell into ruin and abandoned, and the last reports of his temple still standing were in the 13th century, and at that point it was ready to collapse. In the 19th century, European explorers discovered that almost nothing of the city remained. The location of the temple remains lost to this day. It's possible that the Atlantis records were relocated. Egyptologists strongly believe that the famous Rosetta Stone artifact, which was rediscovered in the city of Rashid, was originally displayed in the Temple of Sais. At some point, it was moved to Rashid, and then forgotten for what it was and used as construction material for a defense fortress. Thankfully, the Rosetta Stone survived to be discovered centuries later, so perhaps the Atlantis records may still be found. Then it's just a matter of how long it takes them to be identified for what they are. One of the greatest archaeological finds in our history, a certain megalithic site buried under rocks on a mountaintop in Turkey, was discovered in 1963. Istanbul University and the University of Chicago both sent teams of archaeologists and anthropologists to the site, and when they arrived, these experts were disappointed to see nothing but a misshapen mound littered with broken stones. Today, the mutual conclusion of these investigations haunts archaeology as one of its most shameful moments. They wrote it off as nothing more than a trashed and abandoned medieval cemetery. Thus, the site was dismissed and ignored for the next 31 years. That was until 1994, when a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt happened to be inspecting nearby sites in the region, and having read a footnote referencing this medieval cemetery during his research, he visited it out of curiosity. In Schmidt's own words, the moment he saw it, quote, "It was clear right away this was a gigantic Stone Age site," end quote. That site was Göbekli Tepe. Today, Göbekli Tepe holds the crown as the world's oldest scientifically recognized permanent human settlement, as well as the home of the oldest megaliths ever discovered. And we should pay close attention to it because every year, there's more and more evidence that Göbekli Tepe was built by the survivors of the Younger Dryas apocalypse. The most obvious is that its original construction began virtually at the end of the Younger Dryas, around 11,500 years ago, as far as we know. But considering that only less than 10% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated as of 2022, there's a good chance it could be older, and a perfect match on the timeline. The mainstream belief declares that the very primitive hunter-gatherer people of Göbekli Tepe were animists, those who believed in and ritualistically honored the innate and unique spiritual essence of things. For Göbekli Tepe, masterful relief carvings of animals such as the fox, snake, boar, ibex, vulture, and scorpion are everywhere. The majority of the site's famous T-shaped pillars feature a single animal, and some entire rooms have their own dedicated animal theme. So it's not surprising one might conclude that they were worshipping animal spirits. However, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the significance of animals in both Western and Eastern astrology. Göbekli Tepe's animals could have represented constellations and other celestial sites as possibly the first rendition of the zodiac. Despite it being commonly accepted that Göbekli Tepe was a site of religious worship, there's actually more evidence against it than for it. When Klaus Schmidt excitedly called it the world's first temple, this led many people to assume he meant it was a site of religious worship. Schmidt would later clarify that he really just meant two general things: that Göbekli Tepe was extremely ancient, and that it was a purposeful structure. More recent evidence is beginning to suggest that Göbekli Tepe's purpose may have been astronomical observation. And that's not too surprising. There's significant evidence that astronomy was the focus of other extremely ancient sites with a similar circular design of megalithic pillars, such as Stonehenge in England and Nabda Playa in Egypt. Their designs were calculated to align with the occurrence of celestial events, such as solstices, eclipses, and moon cycles. However, if Göbekli Tepe was a celestial observatory, it would be the oldest by several thousand years. Evidence of advanced astronomical knowledge 11,500 years ago would overturn the historical narrative that humans at that time were no more than simple hunter-gatherers. So, no surprise, this theory is controversial, especially with evidence that the site wasn't only astronomical, but that it might contain a genuine record of the Clovis Comet impact. In 2017, the chemical engineers Dr. Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Sakritsis published an academic report that explained in obsessive detail the overwhelming evidence that Göbekli Tepe's animals represented the zodiac, that the orientation of the megalithic pillars aligned with the location of certain star groups some 13,000 years ago. They also came to a shocking conclusion regarding Pillar 43, the one that clearly isn't like the others. As I mentioned, most of the T-shaped pillars are dedicated to a single animal, but one exception is Pillar 43. Compared to the others, 43 contains a complex mix that includes several small and large birds, a scorpion, a dog or wolf, some abstract patterns, and a mysterious central sphere. It also depicts what seem to be 3 large handbags, similar to the ones shown in later Sumerian art of the Anunnaki gods. Finally, though it's easy to overlook, at the bottom right we find the outline of a headless man. You can tell it's a man thanks to the phallic detail, and he's important, by the way. The hypothesis argued by the 2 engineers is as compelling as it is complicated and heavy in terms of mathematics and astronomy. If you want to dig into all their details, I'll leave a link to their paper in the description, but here's a summary of their findings in their own words. Quote, "By matching low-relief carvings of some of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe to star asterisms, we find compelling evidence that the famous Vulture Stone, Pillar 43, is a date stamp for 10,950 BC, plus or minus 250 years, which corresponds closely to the proposed Younger Dryas event, estimated at 10,890 BC. We also find evidence that a key function of Göbekli Tepe was to observe meteor showers and record cometary encounters. Indeed, the people of Göbekli Tepe appear to have had a special interest in the Taurid meteor stream, the same meteor stream that is proposed as responsible for the Younger Dryas event. This Younger Dryas interpretation of Pillar 43 suggests an interpretation for the little headless man at the bottom. It is indicating probably the worst day ever in human history since the end of the Ice Age." End quote. It might be worth mentioning that the carvings resembling Anunnaki handbags at the top are heavily debated as to what they actually represent. A popular theory is that they might be houses, suggesting the existence of an ancient civilization even earlier than Göbekli Tepe. But others suggest they could be the waves of a massive tsunami. And about the headless man, scholars have argued for many years that all the megalithic T-shaped pillars might represent headless men. That's why you might come across theories that Göbekli Tepe was a skull cult, similar to much later cultures in the region who excavated burial sites and removed the skulls for ritual practices, leaving behind a headless skeleton. However, there may be a more practical answer for the headless men megaliths, found in the very genesis of its construction. The prevailing theory is that it wasn't a single society who built Göbekli Tepe, but a range of different groups and cultures from across the region who put aside all differences and worked together for the singular purpose of building and using this site. Göbekli Tepe is one of, if not the earliest permanent human settlement in known history. Prior to the site, it is believed that humans only lived in small nomadic groups. So the question is, what exactly caused humans to settle down? For complete lifestyle and cultural change in our species, with Göbekli Tepe as its genesis, the ancients must have had a very good reason and motivation to do so. So here's my speculation. If Göbekli Tepe was 1. Constructed not long after a cosmic event caused a global apocalypse, and 2. Is the holder of a detailed record of that event, and 3. Its key purpose wasn't mere astronomy, but to monitor meteor streams and earthbound comets. Göbekli Tepe sounds like it was built as a preemptive measure, to see if the next apocalypse was headed our way. In modern times, we do the exact same thing. Every year, an international planetary defense conference is hosted by the United Nations, and the United States government alone spends tens of millions of dollars annually to monitor the cosmos for any potential celestial threats. So it's sensible to consider Göbekli Tepe could have been a watchtower, as well as a community whose purpose was to survive together. And as the foundational pillars of Göbekli Tepe, the megaliths of the headless men were always in view. A memory of the fallen, a reminder of their purpose, and a lasting symbol for their future generations to never forget that the apocalypse may one day come again. There's another big reason to connect Göbekli Tepe to the ancient apocalypse, and it's again directly tied to these mysterious T-shaped pillars. We already know these people were very intelligent. Even if we totally dismiss the compelling theory that they were advanced in astronomy, it's undeniable from the construction itself, the stone cutting and the arrangement and orientation, that the Göbekli Tepe people had significant knowledge of math and geometry. But what about the actual transportation and lifting? The megaliths of Göbekli Tepe weigh anywhere from 10 to 20 to even 50 tons, all made of solid limestone. And that's only counting the less than 10% of the site that's been excavated. The estimated 50-ton pillar is one of the more recent discoveries, by the way. So, how did they lift 50 tons? According to the accepted archaeological narrative, the builders lived in a primitive era long before the invention of metal tools. So, to consider large-scale construction machinery, like a crane, it doesn't seem likely, especially if the builders might have been the survivors of an apocalypse. There are theories of primitive construction methods, of course, but there's a reason why people lean toward the fringe side of things. For many megalithic structures across the world, the local legends suggest strange explanations, such as the idea that the builders simply lifted the stones by hand, because they were giants. And the connection between giants and ancient apocalypses happens to be one of the most prevalent and significant details you'll come across when researching this subject. Could giants be the missing key to this erased era of our history? In 2008, the Russian archaeologist Michael Shunkov and his team ventured into a mountainside cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. This was no ordinary cave though. Its inner earth hollows had been inhabited on and off for as long as 200,000 years. Past residents included Neanderthals, as well as modern humans, such as the Old Believer hermit named Denis, who lived there in the 18th century AD, and from him the cave received its name, Denisovan Cave. In their exploration, Shunkov came across a finger bone. No one knew that it was any different than the other hundreds of fragments they'd collected that day. But 2 years later, they DNA sequenced that finger bone and revealed something that had never before and has never again been discovered. It had come from a girl who died at the age of 13, who was, in fact, a first-generation hybrid, the offspring of a Neanderthal mother and a father of a yet undiscovered archaic human species. The girl was nicknamed Denny, and her father's species was officially labeled Denisova hominins, or Denisovans. The discovery of a new human species was a big deal, thus more expeditions into Denisova Cave commenced, as well as efforts to DNA sequence fossils from previous finds. Over the years and out of thousands of bone fragments, a total of 6 mostly pureblood Denisovans have been identified, 5 in Denisova Cave in Siberia and 1 in Baishia Kars Cave in Tibet. A total of 6, and all truly ancient, the oldest having lived some 195,000 years ago. Due to the fact that the last of their remains were nothing more than singular and small bones, some mere fragments, it remains a mystery what the Denisovan species looked like. Their DNA suggests they had dark skin, dark eyes, and dark hair, and that's about it. However, in a previous expedition into Denisova Cave, a massive tooth was picked up, and thought to have come from a cave bear, as it was 2.5 times bigger than the wisdom tooth of a modern human. In 2010, the paleoanthropologist Dr. Ben Sviola analyzed it, and confirmed that it had come from a Denisovan. But the size was so unreal that he suggested it had to have been some sort of physical defect or biological anomaly. That was until a second huge tooth was found later that year, and Dr. Viola again confirmed it as Denisovan. He then came to an obvious conclusion. Cool. Large teeth with massive roots would probably require massive jaws." End quote. You probably know where I'm going with this. Either our extinct Denisovan brothers and sisters had a megajaw, or their bodies evolved to be somewhat proportional. Thus, it's possible that the Denisovans may have been giants, and we have to wonder, if the Denisovans were once spread across the world, might they have been the real biblical Nephilim, Islam's Yajuj and Majuj, the Norse frost giants, the Greek titans, the Incan first race, and so many more described by our world's oldest traditions? Giants aren't usually spoken of metaphorically in the context of ancient religious scripture or beliefs. More often than not, they're written as if they really lived among us at some point in time, though few in number. One particularly odd connection between most traditional religious narratives of the giants is the fact that their population was almost entirely wiped out by a cataclysmic world reset event. In Abrahamic belief, the Nephilim were drowned by the Great Flood, though some survived. For example, Goliath in the Bible, and certain versions of Gog and Magog, also known as Yajuj and Majuj in Islam. In Greek mythology, the Olympians waged a 10-year catastrophic war against the Titans, where the Olympian forces hurled massive boulders and lightning bolts from the sky to defeat them. And again, some giants remained, specifically the rebel Titans who fought on the Olympian side. In Incan mythology, the very first race of humans were said to have been giants, created by the Incan supreme being Viracocha. This entire giant race was sentenced to drown in a mighty flood. However, Viracocha chose to save two of these giants in a large floating craft made of wood. In the Old Norse text known as the Göbekli, we again see a similar death to survival ratio of giants, as well as the same familiar flood myth motifs. Quote, "The sons of Bor slew Ymir, the giant. Lo, where he fell there gushed forth so much blood out of his wounds that with it they drowned all the race of the frost giants, save that one whom giants call Bergelmir, escaped with his household. He went upon his ship and his wife with him, and they were safe there." End quote. The last of the Denisovans interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans, and thus left traces of their DNA with their children. By tracking down this DNA, scientists have come to believe that the Denisovans probably went extinct some 14,500 years ago. But because this is an extremely loose speculation, it's absolutely possible they could have went extinct 2,000 to 3,000 years later, making the Denisovans a perfect fit on the Younger Dryas timeline. The problem with the Denisovans is that evidence of their existence is so rare that it's hard to say anything about them with confidence, other than their huge jaws and their once coexistence with modern humans. But on that note, why does so little seem to remain of the Denisovan species? We've only found the smallest bones and fragments. What happened to the rest? Maybe that's a clue. Even the vanished Clovis people of North America left more behind. It's like the Denisovans genuinely were wiped from the slate. For as little as we know, there was one artifact found in Denisova Cave that suggests that the Denisovans may have been a technologically advanced people. This was a fragment of a thick chlorite bracelet, which has since been subject to many tests, first sparked by a small hole found on its side. This hole, almost flawlessly cylindrical, is exactly 0.8 centimeters in diameter. And if you take a close look at its interior, the texture reveals that the hole was made using a high-speed drill. According to Dr. Anatoly Derivianko, whose team analyzed the artifact, quote, "We found out that the speed of rotation of the drill was rather high, fluctuations minimal, and that there was applied drilling with an implement, technology that is common for more recent times." End quote. Exhaustive tests confirm that the bracelet is at least 40,000 years old. To add to the mystery, the material it's made of, chlorite, is not found in the region surrounding Denisova Cave. The closest chlorite source is over 125 miles away. Not an impossible walk, but it's still serious distance in a world with no vehicles, and large dangerous predators lurking everywhere. The archaeologist who found the bracelet was Michael Shunkov, the same who picked up the fingerbone of the first-generation hybrid. Shunkov confirmed, quote, "The bracelet was in the same lair where we found a Denisovan bone. It was made using technological methods which nowhere in the world were used so early, in the Paleolithic era. At first, we connected the find with a progressive form of modern human, and now it turned out that this was fundamentally wrong. It was the Denisovans." End quote. Their ultimate conclusion was profound. Out of the 3 human species whose DNA was genetically compatible for crossbreeding, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans, the Denisovans were likely the most advanced in that time, 40,000 years ago. And more than tools, they may have had technology. But if there's a possibility they were giants, anyone consider that the bracelet might have been a ring? The link between giants and cataclysmic global resets is so common in legend, mythology, and religious tradition worldwide that when you dive down the rabbit hole, there are massive hints of what life may have looked like during that missing gap of history before the apocalypse. Arguably, the oldest traditional story of this era comes from the ancient Vedic traditions of India, which evolved into the religion we know today as Hinduism. The idea of a complete world reset is one of the most important concepts in Hindu mythology and cosmology. In the West, we usually consider time as linear. There's a beginning and an end to things. On the other hand, in the ancient East, most held the belief that time and history are cyclical, that the world goes through stages that ultimately end in a reset and restart in the endless cycle of existence. Hindus call this the Yuga cycle. Yuga is an ancient Sanskrit word that translates to age or era, and thus the cycle is split between 4 distinct yugas. Life in each yuga differed tremendously from each other, and the cycle in general might be described as a progressive de-evolution of both mankind and civilization. The first yuga is the Satya Yuga, the age of truth and the longest of the 4 yugas, where mankind and the gods coexisted on Earth, and civilization is said to have achieved its most advanced state. The second yuga is the Treta Yuga, where mankind remained similarly ideal and spiritually devoted, but began to set the stage for future problems. The third yuga is the Dvapar Yuga, where people began to forget or ignore the power the gods had to create, preserve, and destroy. And due to this ignorance, the world started to suffer serious problems. The fourth yuga is the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and the final and shortest era of the cycle. At the end of the Kali Yuga, the world is wiped clean and recreated, and a new Satya Yuga begins. The most ancient literature on the Yuga cycle provides descriptions not of every single Yuga that's ever occurred, but specifically accounts of the most recent cycle. In the most recent Satya Yuga, the First Age, the description of our world and the people in it is almost entirely unrecognizable. In this Satya Yuga, men and women lived incredibly long lives, up to 100,000 years, and according to the scriptures, they were indeed giants. The people of Earth stood an average of 21 cubits, or 31.5 feet tall. They possessed not only unbelievable physical strength, but also psychic abilities. Nothing had to be said or written because all communication was telepathic, as the scriptures describe. Thus, this singular civilization of giants was spread across the world in harmony. It's also believed they lived alongside the gods, whose physical forms were far larger, and who traveled to Earth from the cosmic heavens by means of massive, glorious flying vehicles known as Vimana. Here, we definitely feel some parallels with the Sumerian stories of the Anunnaki, a group of gigantic gods who came to Earth from the far-off cosmos, created mankind, and lived among us on Earth for long periods of time. Also, both groups of gods would eventually reset Earth. In the case of the Anunnaki, they were so frustrated with humanity that they chose to wipe Earth clean by means of a global flood. Though one special human named Utnapishtim was warned in advance, and was commanded to build a massive wooden boat, an ark, so that he and his family would survive the deluge and preserve the seed of mankind. It's more or less the same myth repeated across the planet, most famously with Noah's Ark in the Bible. But there are literally hundreds of versions spanning every continent and even remote islands. Just to emphasize how truly bizarre this is, consider the probability that the ancient mythology of Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean, that of the Incan Empire in South America, and that of the indigenous Miao Hmong people of China all tell a story of a world-sweeping flood sent from the gods, and how the only survivors escaped by use of a special boat. Unsurprisingly, Hinduism has their own matching version of the flood reset Ark survivor myth. However, it's somewhat complicated, because the Hindu version of the Great Flood only happens every 71 Yuga cycles. Remember though, each completed cycle of the 4 Yugas still ends in the world being reset, just that the description contains no specific mention of a flood. However, some elements will certainly sound familiar. The ancient Hindu scriptures describe the absolutely terrible state of our planet at the very end of the Kali Yuga, the 4th and last era before the gods reset Earth. As signs that the day of reckoning is near, the world will face extreme climates, both hot and cold, the extinction of all plant life, the extinction of all animals. The air and land will become arid and dry, and in these absolutely desperate conditions, humans will resort to cannibalism. Finally, whoever and whatever is left will be destroyed by an avatar, a material manifestation of the supreme deity Vishnu, the Preserver. This avatar's name is Kalki. There are many prophetic scriptures that describe Kalki in one way or another, but the traditional narrative is that Kalki will fly down from the heavens riding a white horse and flashing his sword in a brilliant glow that will light up the entire sky. A verse from the Gita Govinda specifically describes that Kalki will, quote, appear like a comet, end quote. The narrative tells that when Kalki lands on Earth, his horse will stamp its foot on the ground with such force that the planet will literally plunge down, and when the gods raise it back up, the entire world will have been wiped clean and restored to a pure state. At this point, the Satya Yuga will once again commence, and thus the cycle will repeat. According to Hindu belief, at present time we're actually in the midst of the Kali Yuga. So the story of Kalki impacting Earth is supposed to be prophecy. Or is it? Technically the Yuga cycles repeat endlessly, so this suggests ancient knowledge of a repeating apocalyptic event. We might remember that during Solon's journey to Egypt, the elderly priest spoke similarly when revealing the fate of Atlantis, as not the first time, nor the last. Quote, "There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind. There's a story which even your Greek people have preserved, that once upon a time, Phaethon, the son of Helios, having yoked the steeds in his father's chariot, because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burnt up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt." Now, this has the form of a myth, but really signifies the declination of bodies moving in the heavens around the earth, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth, which reoccurs after long intervals. End quote. It's interesting that this Egyptian priest spoke of time in a similar way to the Hindu scriptures, a more or less cyclical view of history where civilization rises only to be destroyed and reset. Specifically, the ancients were aware that, on occasion, large comets would cross paths with Earth and enter our atmosphere, and their impact would be apocalyptic. They also knew that in each cycle, only a few are privileged with this knowledge, the first generation who survived it, of course. The Satya Yuga, the age after the reset, is known as the Age of Truth because the people are fully aware and at a peak state of consciousness. But as time passes and the Yuga cycle progresses, so does ignorance. the vast majority of later generations would disbelieve, misinterpret, or forget. Eventually, almost all people will be wholly unaware of what's coming. It's hard to say whether the prophecy of Kalki flying down to Earth like a blazing comet was a metaphorical retelling of an ancient apocalyptic event that was once witnessed. Nonetheless, the belief remains that a reset of our world should be expected. It probably won't happen soon, so don't worry too much, but better to be knowledgeable than ignorant. Thank you all for watching. If you want more on floods and giants, check out my video Fallen Angel Demonology explained in obsessive detail. Or if you're looking to dive into more mysteries of Atlantis and Egypt, I recommend my documentary The Sleeping Prophet of Atlantis. Thank you to my patrons, you all keep my production cycle in motion without fear of the YouTube adpocalypse that happens every now and then. And if you'd like to join in, I've got links in the description to pledge monthly or make a one-time donation. It all goes back into these videos. Lastly, don't forget to try out Wonder 2 and use my link. It's really a ton of fun. I wish you all a wonderful new year. Never stop seeking. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.